I would like to welcome everyone to today's open mic session, which is going to focus on the BCK to 12 data, which, as we'll learn, is part of the larger education and labor market longitudinal platform. Um, and it's great data to have in our centers and really, really useful for research, as we'll hear a lot about today. I'm joined by Jeremy Higgs from the BC Ministry of Education and Meghan Dale from StatCan, who are going to tag team this presentation. This is our first open mic with a multi-presenter format, let alone a multi-institution format. So we'll see how she goes. At the end of the event, there'll be a quick feedback survey, which helps us plan future training events and understanding what people found useful and what they maybe found less useful. I'd like to begin, as I continue to admit people, with a land acknowledgement. McMaster University is the host institution for the Canadian Research Data Center Network. The university is located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We'll begin the session today by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous people have to this land. You can visit Native Land Digital, a space where people can learn more about the lands they inhabit, the history of those lands, and how to actively be part of a better future going forwards together. And without further ado, I will just turn it right over to Meghan, and we'll get today started. Thanks very much. Go ahead, Meghan.
Great. Okay. That's working great.
We see it just fine. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, thanks for that introduction. My name is Meghan Dale. I'm an analyst at Statistics Canada in the Canadian Centre for Education Statistics. And for my part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about BC K-12 as part of the Education and Labor Market Longitudinal Platform, or ELMLP. So this presentation is broken into three parts. First, I'll give a brief recap of the ELMLP and how BC K-12 fits into it. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the ELMLP itself, as Laura Gibson covered that last summer. And instead, I'm going to mostly focus on a high-level overview before digging into BC K-12 data specifically. And after that, I'll give some examples of how BC K-12 is being used both at the research data centers and within Statistics Canada. And then finally, I'll turn it over to Jeremy, who will talk about BC, and then we will have some questions. So, what is the Education and Labor Market Longitudinal Platform? It's an environment that allows for the integration of anonymized variables from core education-related administrative sources with those from other selected data sets. It allows access to longitudinal cohort analysis for a better understanding of student pathways through the post-secondary education system and the impact of education and training on career prospects in terms of earnings. So what it is not a large integrated data set, but rather a relational data environment. And it does not contain any personal identifiers. Anonymous linkage keys are created using the social data linkage environment. So, as part of our mandate, guaranteeing the security of sensitive statistical information within Statistics Canada is a top priority. We deploy state-of-the-art tools and processes that prevent disclosure and ensure the confidentiality and privacy of individual data. And only aggregate, non-confidential data are released outside of Statistics Canada. So there are three core files to the ELMLP: the post-secondary student information system, the registered apprenticeship information system, and the T1 family file tax data. So PIECES is a national administrative survey on enrollments and graduates of Canadian public post-secondary institutions. It collects information pertaining to programs and courses offered at an institution, as well as information regarding the students themselves. The RAISE compiles data on the number of registered apprentices taking in-class and/or on-the-job training in trades that are either red seal or non-red seal, and where apprenticeship training is either compulsory or voluntary. And the T1FF, or TIF, is a source of data on income, tax credits, and deductions for individuals who have completed a T1 tax return and their dependents. So the TIFF that is part of the ELMLP core files is a tax file limited to the populations of PCES and race. Thus, to be found in the TIFF of the core files, an individual must be in the PCES or race database for at least one reference year. And for those who know the BC K-12 data set already and its corresponding TIFF file, that is a different file with a different population, which I'll describe in a moment. So all three core files are updated on an annual basis, usually in March of each year. In the upcoming months, we'll be releasing the 2021-2022 year of PCES, the 2022 year of RAISE, and the 2021 tax year of TIFF. So given the three core files of EMLP, we can now look at the true potential of the platform, which is its ability to integrate these data sets with many others. So in addition to the three core files, there are more than 15 supplementary files. So on the left are what I would refer to as type 1 supplementary files, which are concordance key files, in that there's a key file that has no microdata on it, but which uses an anonymous identifier from one of the core files to match individuals to a different anonymous identifier that exists on the supplementary file dataset. And on the right are what I would refer to as type 2 supplementary files, which are microdata files that share the same anonymous identifier as the core files, which can then be used to identify the same individual in both data sets, as they'll have the same identifier. So all the supplementary files can be integrated with PCES Raise and the PCES Raise TIFF, and the little cross icon next to some of the files indicates that the target file for those keys is a survey, so only a proportion of the population is represented. Everything else without a cross is an administrative data file. But since we're here to talk about BC specifically, as you can see, BC K-12 is a type 2 microdata file, indicating that on the data file itself, there is an identifier for each individual, which can then be matched with PCES Raise and the PCES Raise TIFF. Though, as you'll see in a second, we still use concordance files with BC. So given all that, all the overview of EMLP in general, what does BCK to 12 look like within the platform? So if you're a researcher or analyst who wants to access BCK to 12 through the RDC, what will you get? So BCK to 12 is actually a package of files, and some or all of these can be requested depending on research needs. So the main BCK to 12 data is broken into three files. The analytical file, which is the largest and has information on student performance for each year they were in school in BC. Then there's the completion rate file, which is typically used to look at high school graduation rates. And then the eligible to graduate file, which is typically used to look at post-secondary transition rates. So if you were to request BCK to 12 data, you get all three of these files together. And in addition, Statistics Canada provides a T1 family file that is specifically for BCK to 12 students. So while the PCES Raise TIFF file is a population of those who appear in PCES or Raise, the BCK to 12 TIFF file is for those who appear in BCK to 12. We also provide a concordance key files for BC K-12 students found in the long form of both the 2016 and 2021 census. And these files are updated each time BC K-12 is updated. So it will include the newest year of TIFF that we have, along with adding any new students to the census concordance key files. And finally, there are three files that were produced by independent projects at some point in the past, which have now been widely released to RDC users who may request them, but are not updated with each new release. So the first is a T1FF file for BCK to 12 parents. That is the parents of the students who are found in BCK to 12, which goes up to the 2017 tax year. And this is often used to look at, for example, the impact of parental income. And there's also a Census 2016 concordance key file for BCK to 12 parents and a record of employment concordance key file that goes up to 2020 for BCK to 12 students and parents that were found up to and including the 2018-2019 school year. So now that I've gone over the data, I'll just describe briefly some of the ways the data set's being used. So there are currently 110 active ELMLP projects in the research data centers, and of those, 38 of them use the BC K-12 data set in some way. So as you can see, it's a fair number. It's actually one of our more popular supplementary data sets. And the research in the RDCs run the gamut from studying labor market outcomes to post-secondary enrollment to gender and indigenous inequality to parental impact and so on. In addition, as BC K-12 is currently the only source of K-12 data in the ELMLP, while researchers will sometimes use the data set to look at British Columbia specifically, it's quite often used as a proxy for pan-Canadian indicators and trends within primary and secondary school. So as for how we use the data set internally at Statistics Canada, there's been several papers published or in the process of being published using the BC K-12 data set. Um, so ones that are currently out now are the gender differences in STEM enrollment and graduation. What are the roles of academic performance and preparation? High school academic performance and earnings by post-secondary field of study, and enrollment of British Columbia high school graduates with special education needs in post-secondary education and apprenticeship programs, a case study of the class of 2009-2010. So these are all available. They've been published already, and they've been done by analysts who work at Statistics Canada. In addition, we have several upcoming releases. I'm not going to read the whole descriptions because they're very long, but instead I'll just read the titles and then pause to allow you to look at them. And then, of course, you can look them up later. So coming at the end of February, there's high school graduation and post-secondary enrollment of Black, Latin American, and other population groups, what explains the differences. Graduation of high school students in British Columbia from 2010-2011 to 2018-2019, a focus on special needs status, and that's coming at the beginning of April. Also at the beginning of April is the demographic profile and post-secondary pathways for dual credit students in British Columbia from 2004-2005 to 2018-2019. That's my paper. I'm very excited about it. And then at the beginning of May is enrollment and persistence in post-secondary education amongst high school graduates in British Columbia from 2010-2011 to 2014-2015, a focus on special needs status. Right. So how to learn more then, I guess, if you want to know about BCK12. So these are my shameless plugs. So Statistics Canada releases a quarterly ELMLP newsletter, which has a full list of the research projects that I mentioned earlier, with full titles and names of researchers. So you can look at what they're doing, and as well as current and upcoming data and paper releases about BCK12, but about the ELMLP in general. So the next issue is coming in March. There's also a monthly BCK to 12 brown bag meeting that's on the second Wednesday of each month, where researchers in government and at post-secondary institutions take turns presenting how they're using the BCK to 12 data. There's a lot of really interesting and cool information that has come up in those meetings. So I would highly recommend. If you haven't have access to the newsletter already, you can feel free to contact me. My contact information is going to be at the end of this, and we can get you added to the distribution list. And for the brown bag meeting, I believe you can contact either Christine Neal at Wilfrid Laurier, who's the organizer, or you can contact me, or I'm sure Jeremy, and we can put you in touch with them if you want to come to the brown bag meetings. And if you're interested in EMLP in general, there's a couple of documents that I could point you to. The first is an overview document, which has everything I talked about, but in much more detail about all of the files and the supplementary files. And that's available online. There's also the data available in the Research Data Center's database, where if you filter by EMLP, you can see all of the data that is currently available in the RDCs and the years that they have. And finally, there's the ELMLP user guide for RDC users, which is available in the RDCs for anyone who has access to any of the ELMLP datasets. They will also get this as part of their documentation package. And then finally, if there's any questions at all about BC K-12 or ELMLP, please feel free to contact me. We are always happy to answer. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Now, shall I take over and okay, we'll talk a little bit more about the BC K-12 data and why it's here. So thank you for having me, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I am Jeremy Higgs. I am the Executive Director of the Education Analytics Office in the Ministry of Education and Childcare, actually. We had that division added to us last year. And we have the roots of doing this actually predates the ELMLP, and it predates me being in this ministry when I was in a different ministry where we were looking to link post-secondary data and education data to our jobs training data that came to us via ESDC. And we wanted to analyze what kind of people ended up in the skills training programs that we had in BC that were funded by the federal government. And we found out all kinds of interesting things there, like the most common age for people in skills training was 19. So why would that be? What was our education system not doing that we were having so many people come to skills training at such a young age? So the roots of that was there. And then when the ELMLP came together, we had the right people here in this ministry who were interested in then making the connection and getting our data in here, because we had both research questions, but also a couple of operational questions. And the research questions were about, what happens to our graduates, after our K-12 graduates, what happens and where do they go for post-secondary, if not British Columbia, and where and what happens to them? What are the patterns of their income over time? And there was also an operational need because we have something called a framework for enhancing student learning. And it has amongst its indicators transitions to Canadian post-secondaries. And I'll take a second to explain that. British Columbia has about 5 million people in it. It has about 700,000 students between public schools and independent schools. About 600,000 of them are in public schools and almost 100,000 of them are in independent schools. There are 60 school districts. They are like 60 little countries. And they range from the smallest is in the northwest of the province, Stikine. It has fewer than 200 students, to the largest, which is in the Lower Mainland in Surrey, which is now over 82,000 students. And so when we would talk to districts about their outcomes of their services, out of their educational services, and we talked to them about transitions to post-secondary, a number of them would say, well, you can't calculate our post-secondary transitions just to BC institutions, because a bunch of our kids go elsewhere in Canada and some of them go internationally. So while we'll never know, we're unlikely to know the international story anytime soon, because of the ELMLP and the post-secondary information system and the RAIS, we were able to start to get into that more. And now we understand much better, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but we now understand much better what the patterns are. And there are certain districts where students are more likely to go to a post-secondary outside of British Columbia. And so that's a big piece of operational data that is actually important for us to know. And it's an area that we want to get into farther. We did do a bunch of research in 2019 and 2020. And what we found, because this has been a very profitable endeavor, we found that that designations matter, and how kids do in school when you look at the entire country. We already knew that here in BC. Indigeneity matters, especially on outcomes for income. The regions of the province, where you come from in the province, matters on your income. And of course, a rural urban area matters too. Independent schools matter a lot in a number of things. And even though our independent schools are very heterogeneous, they range from really small scale distributed learning or online schools to college prep schools. They tend to have better outcomes. We also have in our public school system, we have French immersion schools, which are in the public system, but emphasize French, of course, and they tend to do better than non-French immersion public schools as well. And then the bigger things that we found out were that courses and course marks matter a lot to outcomes. And one of the big ones with regard to that is that for here in British Columbia, we had two kinds of English courses that you could do to graduate. And one was English 12, which would be the kind of course that a university or a post-secondary would be looking for. And for admission. And then we had something called composition or communications. And it was kind of a lower standard to graduate. And what we found out was that you did better getting a D in English 12 than you did getting an A in the communications course. And it mattered to your career a lot. And these were the kinds of things that, might seem intuitive, but they really kind of confirm patterns for us. And it set out a really good basis for what we were doing. Of course, the other thing we found out was that being male or female mattered a lot too. And of course, what we saw in the patterns that we saw, which dated back to data, from the 90s, was that males did better than females. What we're hoping to do in the future years is to see, as we get farther into the 90s, into the 2000s, and into the teens, whether those gaps in our students change and narrow. I want to speak a little bit about some of the subtleties in our data because they're really important when you're doing research. And for those of you that are in a ministry or have done research on education data, it's probably the most subtle sets of data that I've ever had to work for in terms of specification. And I have a background in healthcare economics and in labor market economics. And education is by far the most sensitive. And a good example of that for us is in Indigenous data. Something I should mention just before getting into that is it's important to remember that a lot of our data, particularly the demographic data, is collected for funding. We don't collect it almost all the data we collect is either for funding or it's for granting a credential. Which is why we have so much on demographics and outcomes. And so it's quite operational in that way. And one of the things that gets very complicated is that with the way we fund Indigenous students is that we ask the students to self-report their indigeneity. We ask the students whether they are living on reserve or off reserve. And we don't ask much more than that. We don't ask if they're First Nations, we don't ask if they're Métis, and we don't ask if they're Inuit. That hopefully is coming in the next couple of years. That's a whole other open mic session. But it's a good example because one of the things that happens is that it's possible for a student to declare that they are Indigenous in kindergarten and then never declare again because they do it each year. So we have to be able to determine whether or not we're specifying whether it's in-year indigeneity or ever indigeneity. So if you do it in kindergarten and we're using an ever specification, we'll pick that student up as Indigenous for the rest of their career. The other thing that happens, of course, is that Indigenous student may get to grade 11 or 12 and declare themselves Indigenous. And then we have to do what would be, or we can do something called Indigenous ever backdated. And these are really, really picky things, but they're really, really important to bear in mind in specifying our data and determining it, because the counts can really change. Especially, you might imagine the comparison between an in-year count and an ever count. Another couple of things to mention, just in terms of some of the subtleties, is that we changed our system from provincial exams in the late teens to something we call graduation assessments, which are far lower stakes. Everybody probably knows about doing provincial exams and that they matter a lot to passing a course, to getting into a post-secondary institution. Our grad assessments are low stakes in that you only have to write one to pass and to graduate, to meet the requirement for graduation. You don't have to pass it. You don't have to, all you have to do to meet the requirement is attempt 50% of the questions on a literacy 10 or literacy 12 or a numeracy 10. So it's changed the scope completely on that. And that's a whole different, that is also perhaps a different open mic conversation. But it's a big thing to bear in mind that a lot of the data you'll see in the ELMLP is with exams and course marks. But you will also, as we get farther into loading more data in future years, there will be grad assessments, and it will change things considerably. Other things that change a lot are the foundation skills assessment, which is also in there. It's a measure for numeracy and literacy in grades 4 and 7. And we've changed it over the years. We've changed the assessment itself. We've changed what it focuses on. A good example of something we've changed recently is we've gone from assessing students in grade 4 and 7 on reading and writing as distinct to now it's just literacy. So we've taken out the reading component as its own component, and that is also changing things up. And of course, the COVID year changed a lot of things in terms of outcomes for us as well, which will be a significant foundation of research for both us here in the province, but also for people across Canada and the world. And then we can see what some of the impacts are. We are definitely seeing impacts of the pandemic amongst outcomes in our own data. So the last thing I just want to touch upon is some of the future things we want to get into. And I mentioned Indigenous. Eventually, we will have distinctions-based data. It's a very large effort going on here in British Columbia with the Anti-Racism Data Act and Anti-Racism Data Act research to develop a new Indigenous data standard. And the data standard at its most basics would be First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. But we don't have agreement with all of the nations. We have 204 nations in our province, and we need to get agreement with them about how to collect data that identify First Nations people as First Nations, BC First Nations, and First Nations outside of BC, and then Métis and Inuit. And it's, as you might imagine, it's a long and intense process. And so that's coming. And then we also will have race-based data eventually as well, because the province with the Anti-Racism Data Act is looking to collect more race-based data here in the province, as opposed to linking to census, which is always an option as well. And some of the big things, the big research questions are still to get deeper into some of the outcomes that we were looking for, and what some of the drivers are for kids and whether they flourish or don't flourish in school. Because we know in BC, with as diverse a province as it is, that we think, roughly, 75 to 80% of how kids do in school is what they bring with them to school. And that's one of the challenges. And our province regionally has a lot of very big differences in how kids do. It ranges from West Vancouver and the Francophone school districts, which tend to have 100% completion rates every year, to some of the more rural districts where completion rates can really vary. They can be as low as 10% a year to 40, 50%. And there's a lot of differences. And that should also be borne in mind when looking at BC data, is that the districts, because there's 60 districts and there's 60 different boards and 204 nations and all kinds of diversity, it really matters. All of that matters a lot. So we're hoping we've gotten some new researchers that are going to be working in the ELMLP amongst our staff, and we're hoping to spend a lot more time in it in the coming year or two and beyond. So I will stop talking with that, and I'd be happy to answer questions or have people have any comments about work that they've done or would like to do. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you to both of you. We got a couple quick questions in the chat while we were kind of firing away there. Jeremy, you talked about the skills assessments. Megan or Jeremy, do either of you know if those are coming in as part of the linkage? And then if so, what year that would reflect?
As far as I know, it's there.
Oh, the skills assessments are there
Foundation
already?
skills assessment, yeah. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say that yes, the foundation skills assessments are there for going back as far as they went. So I think it goes all the way back to the beginning of the data in the 90s. Yeah.
Yeah. The FSA was something, it was called the PLAB before it was the FSA. And so it has a lengthy history. And then when it became the FSA, it was one of those changes and the way that they did the assessment.
Okay. Is there anything in the BCK data about students with disabilities? Are they identified in any way?
They are.
Okay. And is that
And
self-report or?
Yes, it's self-reported, and this is another one that sparks a lot of conversation about the specifications in it. We have 12 designations. Not all of them are funded. And what we have observed over time, of course, is that there's pretty steady growth, and growth that exceeds growth in funded categories exceeds growth in non-funded categories. This is something that needs to be borne in mind, because while there definitely are, for example, far more students who have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder for so many reasons and so many good reasons, there's also perhaps some of those diagnoses and some of those designations are maybe chasing the funding a bit, because autism diagnoses have grown at 10% per year for over the last decade. It's not the biggest group here in BC. That's still learning disabilities, which is to say dyslexia is the most common one. But autism is one that has grown a lot. You here in BC, you can be diagnosed either by a medical professional like a pediatrician or a developmental pediatrician, or by a clinical psychologist, as in a private clinical psychologist. And we've heard anecdotal evidence that in order to secure resources, sometimes parents are chasing that autism diagnosis. And it is something that it hasn't confounded our work, but it's something that when we see that designations grow each year faster than enrollment. And this last year, our enrollment grew by 2%, designations grew in total by 5.6%, and autism was 11%. And so those data are there. They're super important, and we make a lot of use out of them, because one of the biggest things we see when we analyze outcomes data is that if you are not Indigenous, not designated, not English language learning, not international, you have the highest likelihood of graduating. But if you are Indigenous, if you are a child and youth in care, if you are designated, you have the lowest likelihood of graduating. And so the designations matter a lot. And it's good that they're in there. And I'm glad that I can see in a couple of the papers that Megan showed that there are some research that's going on in it. And I hope that continues. Thanks.
Okay, so there was a follow-up from the earlier question. The new skills assessment for those born after 2002, this person who presumably has access says they're not currently in BCK to 12, while the FSAs are. So is there a different skills assessment that she's asking about?
It's probably that grad assessment. Yeah. So they'll start getting loaded in with the next ones. In the next couple of years, we'll start putting in the grad assessments.
Okay, perfect. Just before there is another question in the chat, but another option, as the open mic name suggests, is you can just raise your hand and I'll try to call on you if you'd like to, ask your question in person. That's always nice for the people on this side of the camera as presenters to see a different face. So the next question in the chat is asking Jeremy to speak a bit more about the implications of this grad assessment that's coming versus the provincial exam / course mark.
Well, certainly the thing that's a confounder for us is the grad assessment it's unlike, when I did provincial exams way back in the 20th century, you wrote it, you had one chance and that was it, right? Like you just did it. The grad assessments are far more flexible. They're meant to assess your competencies in numeracy and literacy. And it's largely because our curriculum changed in the late teens and really went away from some of the, for lack of a better word, some of the hard assessments of, can you answer this algebra question, to can you understand a problem in numeracy that sort of combines, certain elements of both math and real world situations, and it wasn't teaching to a particular part of a course like Algebra 12. It was, what numeracy did you pick up in your math courses and maybe in some science courses and maybe in some social sciences, to sort of test a competency like both numeracy and also too, critical thinking and problem solving. And in doing that, when we set it up so that, yes, you had a numeracy 10, but you didn't actually have to write it in grade 10. You could write it in grade 11 or grade 12, which is, of course, very common for students with designations. They have that flexibility to be able to do that. You can also write it more than once. So you can write it, we have 3 to 4 sessions a year, but you can also, try to improve your proficiency assessment, because there's no letter grades. It's, emerging, it's proficient, it's on track, it's extending. Those are the kinds of things. So you can write it over again. So the implications are, we don't have provincial exam grades anymore. We don't have provincial that. And so we're now relying in our own assessments on course marks. And course marks tend to be noisier than provincial exam marks. So we're going to have to be dealing with that in our research and analysis. And then the other thing is, what's happening to course marks after the end of provincial exams? What are the patterns of course marks amongst students, such that without provincial exams, do the course marks stay the same as they were before provincial exams? Do they get worse or do they get better? And that's a piece of work that we're definitely looking into, just even in our own work. And one of my staff is going to be doing a presentation on that for us pretty soon, to look at pre and post provincial exams and what course mark distributions look like. So I hope that answers it. There's some pretty big implications of these grad assessments. I will tell you, when it comes to briefing a minister on the release of this data, it's one of the toughest ones to do, because it's not as easy as saying we have this many kids in the system, or we have this many kids And the completion rate is 91%. And grad assessments are really messy to brief ministers on and to try and explain in a way, because I don't know, maybe they'll get some refinement over the years, but yeah, they're a little more difficult. Thanks.
Okay. So since we're prioritizing the audience, is there anybody in the audience that has a question? I'm happy to ask a few self-serving questions to fill in the spaces. But while you're thinking of things, Megan, you might want to jump on this one because I think a lot of the stuff was done, from StatCan. But what are the implications of using BC as a test bed for, as being the only province in the platform that has the K-12 data? Where are we seeing weaknesses compared to, having data from the individual provinces in the platform?
Yeah, I'm not sure that, because we don't have the other provinces to sort of compare them to. I will say that Ontario data is coming relatively soon. But right now, I think people are looking to BC and saying like, okay, this is what we have, and it's a really great data set. I mean, not to, just to hype it up, but it is actually it's very complete, and it's very easy to use, which I think is really nice for people who want to use it, just because of the way that it is structured, where there's records for every year, and there's just so much information, that I think that there's a lot of nuance that can be got out of the BC data if you're looking for very specific questions. Obviously that there's, limitations to every variable, to every piece of data, administrative data, so that always has limitations of its own. But I think part of the reason, not just because it's a data set that is like the only province that we have, I think it also is just like a really great data set to be able to get at some of those K-12 issues, or I guess like K-12 indicators that you can really sort of dig into. There's just, as I think I mentioned, I think the analytical file has 300 variables in it. It is very complete. And there's a lot of coverage as well. Like it goes back quite a long way. And it goes up to, currently what, 2001, 2002. So or 21, 22. Sorry. So it's until very recently. So I don't know that I can specifically say like how BC compares to Canada, just because we don't have the data to be able to make those clarific, like, those answer those questions. Maybe someday that would be great. But as it is now, I think that people like to use it like that because it is a very complete data set, and it is basically a census of BC, of the BC student population. So it's really robust, and I think that's why it's really just as popular as it is, and why it's as useful as it is.
And then I had another question before I turn back to the. Oh, never mind. We've got a hand. Is it whose hand is up? Shanique.
Hi, thanks for that information. I actually have a little bit of a nitty-gritty question, because I know, Jeremy, you're talking about, how some courses are weighed differently, or we know that they impact outcomes differently, and specific, like you could identify specific courses. So my question is about sort of how we factor in the GPA. And so I'm interested in the FSA, the Foundational Skills Assessment. And I know that the GPA is calculated with the foundational skills assessment and part of the courses, but I don't know which courses. So I just wondered if you could give a little bit more information about that, and whether or not in that in the choice of those courses that are in the GPA, whether there's any way that we could trace back whether or not they're impactful on outcomes. Like if you've identified, or, I mean, I don't know if you have released which ones are there, but I'm just trying to see GPA, what does it mean, and whether we can, back out some of the courses that are calculated in that, or just because all I can see is that it's FSA and GPA and courses, but which ones do they matter?
Well, so FSA is grade 4 and 7, so we tend to use it to distinctly and discreetly. We don't wrap it in with course with GPA at all. But we do use it to predict outcomes. And how you do on FSA does have a statistically significant relationship to your likelihood to graduate. And not writing the FSA, which, if you know BC politics, is a thing in some districts, also has a statistically significant relationship to your graduation. If you don't write the FSA, you're actually less likely to graduate. So, Janique, your question, I think I'm trying to answer, is we don't actually roll them together. When we're doing GPA, FSA and grad assessments don't, but the exams, I think, do. And that I'd have to get some more detail for you, and we can always connect afterwards if you want and talk about your question more, because my economist can definitely get into that deeper, if that's okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, we have a hand from Fernando Saltiel also.
Hey, so sorry, I arrived late, and if you already answered that, I apologize for that. Is there any resource that I might be able to find to better understand what exams were required at different points in time? Because I have access to the data and looking through it, you see certain years, certain cohorts, they took the math assessment in 10th grade, then it switches to 12th grade, and I've just had a bit of a hard time understanding how these requirements work in a structured way. I've had to ask some of my students who grew up in BC, oh, did you take this exam or that exam? But I couldn't find anything online that was classifying every year. And again, apologies if this was already asked. Thank you.
That's a great question. It used to be you only had to write English 12. That was the only one you had to write. And then if you wanted to get into a research university, you had to write 3 or 4 other provincial exams at basically your choice, depending on what you wanted to get into. But English 12 was the only one you had to write. And so for me, going into economics, of course, there was algebra at the time, and and various other things. But that's the main one. And what we can do is that we can look at the history, and I certainly have enough people hanging around this ministry that I could probably ask them how that's changed over time. But for the longest time, it was English 12 was the one mandatory one, then everything else was arranged around what you hope to do afterwards.
Great, that is excellent. I think the data is fairly informative in that case, but just as a researcher, being able to say, this was required or this wasn't, would be super valuable, at least in my case. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Sergey. In the last release of BC K-12 data, the location variable, lat long, was removed since it wasn't accurate. Is there plans to fix or include this information in future releases?
That's a great question. I don't think you know what? I should actually ask and find out. This tickles my mind a little bit because I seem to remember this happening. So I'll have to go, Sergey, I'll have to follow up on that for you. And I've noted it down here, and I can get you some notes and send them over to you.
Okay.
Because you're still the same email address you were before, I presume. I could just look you up.
Just post it in the chat, Sergey.
Okay,
if you're still at the email that you are before.
Yeah.
And I would like to touch on do you know if ELMLP has been crossed with EDI or MDI? Paulina, we might need those acronyms.
I know what they are. It's
okay.
Early Development Instrument and Middle Years Development Instrument. They are both products of the University of British Columbia Human Early Learning Project. And as far as I know, no, ELMLP has not done that. We here in BC don't have access to MDI data. We do have access to EDI data, but we haven't done a lot with those data, and that's another whole question about that, because both the EDI and the MDI are meant as population. You probably know this, Paulina. They're meant as population reporting, and so getting into individual level stuff with EDI or MDI is a tricky business because it's not a census. So I'll leave that there.
So for somebody who is interested in sort of the impacts that happen in early childhood, what kind of data are in the K end of the K to 12? Like we've talked a lot about secondary school, but we haven't talked a lot about sort of K to 5.
Yeah.
So what kind of things are in there that someone who's interested in that kind of research might look at?
Oh, not a lot, which is something where we would love to be able to do more of. The EDI serves a bit of a it's one of the main measures here in British Columbia, and I see Sarah's comment from Nova Scotia, and I'm glad for her to jump in there and remind me that it's not just here in BC. It just happens to be that they're located here in BC, and but the thing is that thank you, Sergey. The EDI for us is one of the only measures we have. It's a vulnerability measure, and what we don't collect in the ministry, because we don't have any funding requirement for it, is we don't have anything that tells us much about the kids at age 5. We tossed around the idea of things like doing sort of an assessment. There are individual school districts that do assessments of their kids, and there's one in particular that does an amazing assessment of their kids in kindergarten, where they do not only an education assessment, but they do health indicator assessments with nurses from the local health authority. And that is a model I would love to have in the entire province as a census. Of course, that would be quite expensive, and I need to track down some funding for that. But it is a huge gap. And I've been in this job now for 5 years. And one of the first things the Assistant Deputy Minister and I talked about, the one at the time, Keith Godin, was we don't have enough information about 5-year-olds. And we don't have enough individual level information about 5-year-olds. We here in the ministry, through Brett Wilmer and his team, one of whom is here today, and shall remain nameless, developed a kindergarten index. And we were able to take data from our data set and from other ministries' data sets, because we have a program called the Data Innovation Program, where all of those administrative data are pooled. And we were able to develop a student level index, but the problem is that we can't take it out of that environment, and we can't use it at an individual level. We can only use it in aggregate. So this is something else we're definitely looking to get at, is addressing getting more data for 5-year-olds, and we've got a couple of options. So stay tuned.
Well, you don't necessarily need Big N. Like you can choose a subsample of people too. It doesn't have to be everybody. I know you'd rather everybody, but when money's a question.
Yeah, I think that the thing I think we're going to try, this is one of those things, I don't believe in going for the home runs like myself and a whole lot of things, but this is one where I actually really feel like if we could get a census of 5-year-olds, we would do so much better, and we would know so much more. And so you're right, we may end up doing that again, of course, but we would really love to have something that is a population measure for that. Don't stop talking, just in case there's more questions before the
No
end.
problem. We are coming up on time, so I will put out a last call for questions in the remaining 5 minutes. This presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. Megan had posted her email address before if you need to reach out to either of the presenters who have promised you something and then forgotten about it, which they're both busy people and I'm sure is possible. You can reach out to me directly. I'll just get Ryan in the chat to post our post-event feedback survey again. And then there we go. Oh, no, that's the YouTube channel. And then we'll just get the post-event feedback survey. I'll leave it open for a little bit and we'll close today's session. Thank you so much to both of you for presenting and to everyone who attended. Super, super valuable information. This went swimmingly well, so